Wow.
Hello.
I feel like I'm in the future.
Awesome. Very good.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you.
So this is NiCHE Conversations. I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am, joined by Ruth Morgan. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. I'm Ruth Morgan. As Jessica indicated, I'm coming to you from Australia. I'm coming to you from the beautiful unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples from Canberra. And I work at the university, Australian National University. I can't even introduce myself. What a fumble, but here we are.
Excellent. So we're going to be talking about a talk. Well, it's kind of like it's a informal little preview of a talk you're giving next week for the Department of History at Carleton University. They have their Shannon Lectures, and this is a series of lectures that they hold, I think, multiple times a year. It's usually a set of 4 lectures, and this time it's all about climate and weather, and you are the final talk. But at some point, you can find the link to register for the Zoom version of this talk on our website. And you're going to be talking about climate diplomacy and its histories inside the IPCC. Did I say too many C's there? I think so. Anyway, whatever. But that's what we're going to be talking about today a little bit. And I thought we would just start by talking about, what is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and when and why was it formed?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. It's sort of one of those acronyms, I think, that gets thrown around a lot. Mm-hmm. And certainly I'm starting to really accumulate a long list of these acronyms because they just proliferate, and you're supposed to know what they are. Mm-hmm. Getting a sense of this jigsaw puzzle is really important, I think, to sort of seeing how it all fits together when we're getting a sense of how we understand climate change. So this particular acronym, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, as you might have heard, is a joint initiative of the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, there's another one, and the United Nations Environment Programme. And it was formed in 1988 to really guide governments, to provide governments, I should say, mm-hmm. not because it's policy relevant, not policy prescriptive, as they always like to say, is to provide governments with that scientific information to help them develop climate change policies and to inform negotiations about climate change. So it's one of these products of a really unique moment, I suppose, in the late 1980s, where we, of course, know now that the world was about to change dramatically at the end of that decade. But at that point in time, all things atmospheric seemed to really consume governments. They've been talking a lot about the problem of acid rain and long-range air pollution. So a problem for people in Canada and the United States, certainly worried about all that smoky air that was crossing the border and not really enjoying that. But it's also a big problem in Europe as well. The Scandinavian countries had become aware really in the early 1970s that smoke from chimneys in the UK and in Germany was drifting up to Scandinavia and causing all sorts of problems. So that was something that had been talked about, and governments were trying to come to some agreement. Of course, these things are never easy because no one really wants to do anything that's going to, at least in their view, affect their economies, affect industry, get them offside. So that was it was a problem for the other country to deal with rather than the source country. And then we have the problem of CFCs, which again seemed to be something that people thought were rather benign until the 1970s, when scientists started to realize, hang on, there's more of them hanging around than there's supposed to be. And that was going to be a problem for the future for the ozone layer. Mm-hmm. And so the concern by the 1980s had really become that the ozone layer was going to be depleted. And the bad thing about that, at least in terms of government concern, was that skin cancer was going to be a real problem. And so that galvanizes some government action. And what's important for our story here is that by the time governments had come to the Vienna Convention for the protection of the ozone layer in 1985, it's just before scientists show that actually there is a hole in the ozone layer. This isn't just something we can predict, it's actually happened. And so those negotiations had been taking place on the basis of what might happen, not what had happened. And so it was a real lesson in taking precautionary action, what is the precautionary principle in international law. And that really, I think, gave a lot of I suppose, support for climate scientists and environmental, I suppose, commentators who were saying, well, all of these greenhouse gas emissions are also very likely to have some kind of global scale effect. Maybe if we acted early, we could potentially arrest some of those worse implications, I suppose. And so we have the WMO and United Nations Environment Program getting together because they already had been in conversations about climate change already. This was something that they were already concerned about from scientists' perspectives, but they hadn't really got governments involved at this point. It was sort of a research problem, something that always needed more investigation rather than any action. But as many of you might know, climate change really hits the headlines in the late 1980s. So the media in North America, in Western Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, really start to sort of think, we're having some warm summers. Maybe something's going on here. Maybe those scientists aren't just sort of talking in wild speculation. Now, this is where the ozone layer issue comes back to haunt us, I suppose, is that the US government felt, the United Nations Environment Program was fairly pushy on that ozone layer issue, and we want a little bit more control over what's going on there. So the other link here is that the developing countries also have felt rather excluded from all of those conversations, scientifically and politically. And they said, well, we want a little bit of a say here because, you know, we might be affected too, and we might to stay abreast of what's going on. We might want to be involved. So this is where it being an intergovernmental panel is really important, because the meetings that had happened up to this point in time were really between scientists and legal experts rather than government representatives. So a lot of the aspirations for controlling the emission of greenhouse gases had been kind of very, very ambitious, because they weren't responsible to a government in a way, whereas the IPCC is coming out of very much a government-sponsored science perspective. This is where the resources for science is coming from, and it's being managed by United Nations programs. And so finally, this body comes together in 1988. We have 3 working groups emerge, which is a suggestion of the UN Environment Program. And they settle on one group working on science, and that's being led by UK scientists, a working group 2 on impacts led by the Soviet Union, and working 3 on response strategies, and that's a United States led initiative. And these are obviously the most scientifically powerful countries at this time. They're commanding the greatest resources. And they have a tight timeline for their first report in late 1990, so they've got around about 2 years max to put together their findings for the Second World Climate Conference. And that first report really, I think, wakes up the governments. If they weren't attuned to these issues already, they come to the conclusion based on their assessment of the literature to date, which is what they do. They don't create new research. They're really canvassing what has been published, so peer-reviewed research for the most part. And that first report says immediate reductions of over 60% of net emissions from human activities would achieve the stabilisation of concentrations of greenhouse gases at today's level. So we need to act early and quite significantly to reduce those emissions. And they pointed out that the world had already been warming over the past century, and that 5 warmest years on record had occurred in the 1980s was a really accelerating issue. And they said that if we continued along the lines of business as usual, and keep on doing what you're doing, those emissions would produce a more rapid increase in temperature than the Earth had seen in the past 10,000 years. So that was a wake-up call and a half for their first foray as a group of scientists collaborating together. Yeah.
Cool. I love that, having that background, because it's an institution that's existed since I was, 3 years old. But I feel like I haven't really been cognizant of it until like the past 5 years. I think that's probably another conversation about like the role of like social media and stuff. Like I feel like I know more about it because I see a bunch of like infographics about it, like the reports and stuff. But yeah, the trajectory of it is very fascinating. Yeah. Anyways, the next question is kind of very broad, so answer it how you will, but succinctly, how would you describe climate diplomacy's relationship to science?
I think it's safe to say that they are intimately related. That's the short answer. And it's hard to say which one sort of leads, I suppose. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg issue, I suppose. And its dynamic has really changed a lot over time. And if we go back to the mid to late 1980s, when we were toddlers, at least Jessica and I, when climate change is really hitting the international agenda, it's scientists that are ringing that alarm bell. And I think what's important here is it's not because scientists are environmentalists inherently or that they are, being alarmists. It's that it's through science that it's only through science that climate change was known, because it's such a large-scale phenomena. It's not, at this point anyway, affecting people on a very everyday basis. It's not a tangible thing. It was being measured by various tools and monitoring networks and satellites and that kind of equipment. So it's not something that everyday people have handy or have the knowledge to really make sense of. And what's important here is also that that kind of technology is also really only available to scientists in the global north for the most part, and not necessarily widely available in developing countries. And that is what feeds into climate models, which become really important in this early period to establish, well, if we are putting all of these greenhouse gas emissions into the air, what is going to happen? And that's where they start to get these calculations of temperature rise and so forth. So with the IPCC's first findings in the early 1990s, in 1990, they are emerging just when this sort of international regime of starting to figure out, well, how should we all act together to deal with this problem? How are we going to come to an agreement where we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Because no one country wanted to do this alone. It was recognised that this was a shared effort. And at this point in time, they're negotiating what becomes the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that UNFCCC, so another acronym for the list. And those scientists at the IPCC, because they're sponsored by their governments, they're nominated by their governments, they're in close relationships with the bureaucrats, with the decision makers, and they're giving them a bit of background, because for a lot of them it was really new on the scene. They didn't really know what was going on or what was at stake, what the possible consequences would be, and how to deal with it, really. So since that framework convention got agreed to, since it came into force in 1994, what's important to keep in mind is that the key objective of that convention is to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. So what dangerous anthropogenic interference is a science question. It's not something necessarily that policymakers can arrive at based on other forms of knowledge. It's very much framed as a physics question or as an atmospheric chemistry question.
And so they're turning to the scientists to guide them, not only in terms of what that threshold of dangerous is, but also what time frame they have to act on. And that's important for policy. You know, well, can we put off acting, or do we really need to do something now? How you know, what are we going to do here? And I think at the point in time when we start having these negotiations, there's a lot of grounds for optimism. You've got this kind of elation at the end of the Cold War. You've got the likes of Francis Fukuyama saying, we've, you know, end of history, all that jazz. So there's a real sense that I think science is going to lead us through. We're going to listen to that scientific evidence, and policy will naturally follow. And it was kind of a bit like that in terms of the Montreal Protocol, in terms of dealing with the ozone layer. Although, of course, there was, you know, an economic challenge there around, well, what will we substitute CFCs with? But in any case, we've seen how that's not quite happened, and that I think it's this kind of issue for governments of how climate change has often become rather inconvenient, or at least their findings are inconvenient. And it's where often we see that sustained effort to question the science, to really amplify any uncertainty. And there's also the issue which comes back to how the science is made, or how those assessments are made. And that's come, I think, to really dog a lot of the negotiations in terms of the participation of the Global South, in terms of where those scientific experts and resources are coming from. And as a result, for quite a long time, and it's only really turning around quite recently, is that scientists from the Global South have been typically underrepresented in these assessments. So that leads to questions about legitimacy of those assessments and about the findings of them. And, you know, that of course then does influence the negotiations. If the developing world is not exactly convinced, or sees this as a way to stymie their development, which has been a long suspicion, then, you know, that's going to really cause a bit of a problem for coming to any agreements. And then the final kind of point I'd add in there is that even with the IPCC, each report has a summary for policymakers. So they sort of try and make it as, you know, understandable as possible for the intelligent lay reader. And so they put together these summaries for policymakers, and governments at their plenary session go through a line-by-line approval process to come to some kind of compromise that keeps the kind of scientific legitimacy and authority of what's being communicated there, but with a governmental massaging. And that can become really feisty, because you've got governments saying, well, if we're the oil producers or the coal producers, we want to sort of suggest that the consequences of our economy are having different impacts than what the report might say. So that becomes very feisty, and I think that has been a historical one of those continuing trends throughout those assessment reports.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of things stuck out to me, like you pointing out that, you know, the Global South and smaller, less economically developed nations have not been, you know, as represented within the science of climate change. Makes sense, but it's something, you know, I haven't really directly thought about. And
well, I think
you know, like,
we understand that it's very difficult to ensure global representation, but the implications, I think, you know, we can sometimes hear a lot of cynical people saying, oh, well, you know, science is science, but it's supposedly objective, but it has a flow-on effect.
Yeah, it is such a crucial point. And also just the point you made that, you know, in the beginning, like, climate change was purely a scientific idea, or, you know, set of data sets, and, you know, how let alone for climate diplomacy, but how difficult that science communication has been, you know, to get the average individual on board or to understand what is happening when they may not be feeling the effects of climate change yet. And, you know, fewer and fewer of us can say that from a personal level. You know, I haven't witnessed any, you know, even me, like being in Saskatchewan for the last 10 years, I've witnessed the winters change considerably. And this winter is reminding me of back home in the eastern states, which is wet, like lots of snow, a bit warmer. And I was like, this winter makes me feel more at home. But then I'm like, ooh, that's actually not good, because the winters here should be very cold and very dry. Anyway, it's also complex, and you know, when you start thinking about it, it's like no wonder we're as a world struggling with this, right?
Yeah.
For
sure. Yeah, not an easy problem. That's I think that's optimism, but yeah, it's proved trickier than anyone thought.
Yeah. So to wrap up, let's touch upon the humanities. So, you know, we've talked about science. How have humanities, on the other hand, influenced IPCC? And, you know, how is this relevant to environmental historians, whether they're climate historians or not?
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting to see hierarchies of knowledge play out here with at the largest of scales, because I can't think of an equivalent that the humanities have engaged in, I suppose. And I think it's something that's really only started to kind of influence what's happening in the IPCC relatively recently. And that's not to say there haven't been changes. It's not as though other disciplines haven't got a look in. Quite early on, economists started to be involved in the second assessment report. There was a real sense that there wasn't a great hold on the economic and social costs of what might be happening. And then you see a lot more geographers, a lot more social scientists coming into the picture in recent times. And what I think becomes very clear by, if not by the end of sort of the ClimateGate era of sort of 2010, but certainly by that fifth assessment report in 2015, that actually climate change isn't just an abstract scientific or economic problem, but it's a historical process, and it really manifests in diverse and uneven ways. And that has started, I think, to really kind of affect how the IPCC has actively sought to change its makeup. So one of the sort of, I think, interesting ways that they respond to those ClimateGate scandals around the release of climate science emails, that was sort of the real gotcha moment, at least as far as a lot of climate skeptics were concerned. They thought, oh, well, we'll find the great kind of secret to what the scientists are up to. Well, it didn't really, but you know, it was definitely a big controversy at the time. But the IPCC starts to recruit early career researchers more actively into the process. That's what they want to prioritise. So it's a bit of a spring clean, because you see a number of scientists have been in multiple assessment reports, and so that's a huge commitment. But you can see how, you know, for the IPCC's perspective, they want to show that we are regenerating, we're taking other perspectives, and we're not just amplifying the voices of a select group. So they start to sort of have a bit of a generational change. And what's interesting also is how the IPCC has tried to, in some ways, use history, or at least history as they see it, maybe not the way academic historians do history, but they included in their 2007 report a chapter by, well, at least included some climate historians. Jim Fleming was one of them, and Mark Carey, I think, has been involved as well, to kind of show how the IPCC fit in a lineage of climate knowledge, of kind of an effort to legitimise themselves, that they were the latest in a kind of Whiggish path to climate enlightenment. Now, some people will say, look, including more humanities and social sciences, is that really going to do anything? Should we just start the whole thing again? Is it even useful? And I think there is something to that critique. It's a very kind of conservative institution for all kinds of reasons. You see disciplinary hierarchies at work, and they're very sort of siloed in their working groups. Even just the way it works, they start off with working group 1 with physical science, and then the other groups follow. It's sort of it's quite explicit in a way. And at the same time, though, I don't think the IPCC is alone in that. Like, even in our own universities and our own sort of societies, we see how knowledge is prioritised or valued differently according to STEM and HASS and all these sorts of things. So I think, that's a bit of a challenge there, especially with how quite often for policymakers and for the general public, very broadly defined, it's that quantification that is supposedly objective, and that's what the IPCC is trying to achieve. So that's going to also privilege some over others. But as we were talking about before, there's been a big emphasis on recruiting more Global South researchers and improving the gender balance as well, which, as you might imagine, was pretty woeful there for a while. And, they've had their own problems with how these kinds of oversights in terms of representation have actually affected the way their findings have been communicated, to the extent that some people's lives in the global north might be valued more highly than those in the global south, for instance, on an economic modelling basis, which was a very unfortunate and problematic episode in the IPCC's history. And so more recently, which I think is really important and I guess reflects a broader change in all of our disciplines, and I think something that humanities is encouraging but also grappling with, is how to incorporate the insights of Indigenous knowledge holders and to incorporate Indigenous and First Nations researchers in the reports, where very often that is very local and place-specific knowledge being sort of sometimes forced into or having to speak to what is at least sees itself as very global science, even though, of course, we know it's very grounded and all those sorts of things. So that's something that when I have been involved over the past couple of years in the latest report, was something that was very explicitly acknowledged that this had been an area that the IPCC had not done very well, and that if it was going to change, it would come down to the contributors to either recruit people specifically, or to actively seek out that literature and knowledge, and to really raise up Indigenous experiences and knowledge in our reports to show not only that there are other forms of knowledge that need listening to, but also so typically these are the most vulnerable people very often, or living in places where climate change is happening, where we can see it, so Arctic Circle, glacier areas, that kind of thing. So that's been a huge, I think, shift in thinking, and so that's really challenged a lot of the more conservative aspects or elements of the IPCC process. So I think, this is an ongoing project, I guess, that the IPCC is grappling with, but not separately from what all of our disciplines are trying to do in terms of whatever decolonising might look like in your discipline, those challenges, and the IPCC hasn't been immune from that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a heartening answer that they're incorporating more humanities, and I always think of one of our greatest challenges is taking our humanities knowledge and making it relevant, or making it seem relevant, I should say, to I don't know where I'm going with this. I guess it's kind of a frustration that we're always expected to make, like, prove that we're relevant. You know, it's like I think it's just a grand challenge, right? And one that I'm always piecing together and figuring out.
And what does relevant look like? And
yeah,
it's something we all but yeah, it's very interesting to sort of have those out of body experiences and look around and go, oh, okay, so this is what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, sometimes as humanities people, you know, we're surrounded by other people who think alike us, and it's kind of jarring sometimes, you know, to have to work interdisciplinarily or with the public or what have you, and realize, you know, these ways of looking at the world that we were trained in are not common, and how do we communicate those things, and how do we speak to each other, and yeah, and also just how westernized all of this is, you know, like how colonized, and, you know, all these problems with like representing different facets of looking at the world are so entrenched in, you know, the Western hold on these kind of things, right? Yeah, it's all very fascinating. Yeah. Well, thank you, Ruth, for joining me today. I encourage everyone to sign up, register for next week's talk, which is on February 6th, which is Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm registered. I plan to be in the audience as long as my baby allows it. We'll see. Evening Zooms are always hit and miss with the baby, but thank you for joining me today. And yeah, take care, Ruth.
Thanks for having the conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I could see some people on Zoom or in person. It'd be great to meet some of you.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah. If you're in Ottawa, you can also check it out in person. So, well, I'll post all of that info probably tomorrow because it's late. So I'll post it again tomorrow. Okay. Well, see you later. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.